good afternoon to you both. Today
Hello,
is
Laura.
the 7th of May.
Hi, Laura.
Hello. Today is the 7th of May and we're in lockdown, obviously. So these kind of chats that we might have had, or the things that might have been events in the past, are now events between three of us on Zoom. So I want to thank you so much, Ed Farrell, and this is Bryan Biggs. So I wondered first, both, if you wouldn't mind just telling me, saying hello, telling me who you are, and yes, Ed.
First, okay. Ed Farrell. I'm a Liverpool-born, very proud of Liverpool and its heritage, and I hope that comes across in the paintings, some of which are behind me, actually. I, in reality, had a long career mostly in IT, in a civil service setting, and trained latterly as an IT architect. 10 years ago, I decided to take art more seriously, and I now regard myself as an artist and architectural illustrator, and hence I'm here now talking about the works. Thank you indeed for the opportunity, I might say, to both you and
yeah, that's okay. Thank you. So, Bryan, would you mind introducing yourself?
Of course, I'm from the South End, and Bryan Biggs. I'm the artistic director at Bluecoat. I'm also an artist, but for my day job, I work at Bluecoat, which, as many of you will know, is the oldest surviving building in the centre of Liverpool. We're very proud of that, and I've done a lot of research over the years because I've been involved in Bluecoat for ages and ages. And we've actually got a book coming out, which I'll talk about a bit later, perhaps, about our history as the oldest building in the city centre. So it's a fascinating story, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. But for now, over to Ed, I think, to talk about his fantastic work.
As I say, about 10 years ago, I set out on, as it was at the time, it was a project that I set myself to catalogue the pubs of Liverpool. And the idea was to produce some kind of guide of the 60 best Liverpool boozers. And I was in the Cavern Quarter and produced a piece of work. Laura, I think you might have that.
I have, I'll get it up.
And the idea was to produce a aerial piece of architectural art that would enable me to say where the pubs were. So I was going to say, and you can see Matthew Street runs down the centre there, with Whitechapel on the left bottom and the roof of the Met Quarter on the right. Right bottom.
Is that here, Ed?
That's actually that's Cavern Walks that you're thinking.
Oh yeah, so this is a modern day.
So the Met Quarter is bottom right.
Okay, got you.
On Stanley Street.
There.
That's it, yeah. So Matthew Street runs down the middle, and the idea was to put indicators to say, here's the Grapes, this is the Cavern, this is the Cavern Club, this is Flanagan's Apple. But when it came to it, I was much more interested in the idea of producing these architectural aerial shots. And at the same time, I was researching Liverpool history. And it became clear to me that Liverpool had become hugely successful over a relatively short period of time. And given the expansion of the city, that uniquely it seemed to be Liverpool's way, that it was constantly demolishing itself and then rebuilding, demolishing and rebuilding. Yeah. So there wasn't an awful lot of antiquity left. So there's a great scope for architectural and archaeological curiosity, really. And I wondered whether or not it would be possible to go back and fly over the city, if you like, at various points in the city's historical narrative, and use this aerial architectural technique to articulate what Liverpool actually looked like in 3D at that time. So that was the kind of beginning. And so I found myself in a well-known bookshop looking for maps, historical maps, and I came across this one. Now, people will be, I'll put it the right way up, people will be familiar with these Ordnance Survey maps, the Godfrey edition. Anybody who's a kind of Liverpool enthusiast will know them. But I thought, what is that? You know, that shape. in the map. And when I looked at the map itself and opened it up, it was fabulous. These are really excellent maps. And as long ago as 1848, some of the earliest Ordnance Survey maps, showing things like the layout of gardens and shrubs and lawns and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I was intrigued, and 3 to 4 months later, I produced a picture of Hope Street. So here on the right-hand side, you can see that shape, that horseshoe shape has now become what was an almshouse.
This one here.
That's right. It's just behind where the Everyman is now, although at that stage it was called Hope Hall.
Mm-hmm.
And the road running down the diagonally down the centre is Hope Street, down towards the bottom where you can see the old Philharmonic Hall,
Mm-hmm.
which burned down in the 1930s prior to the one that we know today. On the left-hand side, there are the homes of the rich who are moving out of the noisy, smoky Liverpool city centre to the outskirts. But we're also mixed in with the poor, the really dreadful conditions that the poor lived in, including the workhouse top centre, which is where the Metropolitan Cathedral is today. And down at the bottom on the right-hand side, you can see a cemetery, which is St. Mary's Cemetery, and that's where the mass graves were for cholera victims. So what I recognised, I think, as well as a piece of art and a piece of history, these are also social documents. But overall, what I realised was this was a scene that nobody had seen for 150 years.
I know.
And longer.
And it brings it to life so vividly. You know, that's why we wanted to speak to you really as well, because I'd just point out St. Philip's Church here as well. That was recently demolished. The last of it was demolished. It was inside, what was that called, Bryan? The Hanover warehouses or something. It had been streets when I was a kid.
Yeah, right. And they found some of the windows, I think.
They found some of the windows. So what
yeah.
was done was build the building around the church, which is a bizarre thing to do. But
that's right.
yeah, and also on the corner here of Hope Street is it's a church, I think maybe Methodist now, and you can still see a bit of it. There's a bit of it still in the pavement.
Yeah, there was a statue out there of the Reverend Hugh Stowell, who was the Reverend there, and that statue was moved to Prince's Park, has now been moved back, I think, is now outside student accommodation.
It is, yeah, it's this again.
I suppose what that did was really just fire up my kind of enthusiasm for doing more. And so I wondered whether it was possible to go back even further to the beginnings of what was Liverpool's success in the 17th century. You know, that time when it was moving from a sleepy agricultural town to a, fishing town to just beginning to trade colonially and with America and the Indies. And so for this one, much more speculative, because for the other painting, there was a good Ordnance Survey map, photographs, later photographs, drawings and engravings. For this one, of course, a handful of paintings and engravings, really, that give us and recreations that give us an indication of what it was like. It was much more fun to do in the sense that I didn't really know any of this. Here we've got a picture of the castle, which was the 13th century castle built by the 4th Earl of Derby. It hasn't got long left, actually. It's going to be demolished fairly soon after this painting, after this date. And you can also see the 7 streets laid out pretty much as they are today. Some with different names, but others are named exactly the same. Tide Barn Street, Dale Street, Water Street. Mm-hmm. Pattern of Liverpool that we can see now. The shore is much further back because we don't have any docks at this stage. Mm-hmm. It's beginning to grow. And on the right-hand side, you can see that inlet, the pool.
Yeah.
It takes its way up to what is the old Haymarket now and is just about to be filled in. So that was quite an interesting one. And if we go forward, I wonder if we can bring up the next one, which is the final one to look at in this series, which is the old dock.
Yes, I've got that, Ed.
Which moved about 55 years, something like that. And in that 55 years, the transformation of Liverpool is dramatic. It, as I say, it moves, the castle has been demolished. So on the left-hand side, it's been replaced by St. George's Church. You can still see the shape of the castle took effectively.
But it's unbelievable, isn't it, how much it's changed? How many
Yes.
years between the first image and that, Ed?
So it's about 55, 56 years.
That long though, is it really?
It's not long. And the town has expanded enormously. The old dock has been built by, is it Thomas Steers, I think, the dock architect.
Mm-hmm.
We're now in the middle of the slave trade, obviously, so, and that's a kind of regrettable advance in Liverpool's history. But nevertheless, the town is booming, and the fleet is expanded enormously.
Massively. And you know, there are people online who sometimes can identify some of these ships. I've seen them trying to do it. You know, from maps, they can identify what those ships, who those ships are, who they belong to. There's an interesting piece of literature, I must just tell you, by Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, called Redburn. And it's autobiographical or semi-autobiographical, and there's a chapter where he comes to Liverpool and he talks about the area all around the docks. It's a bit later than this, but he really paints a vivid picture of it. It was quite gritty and a little bit dangerous. And you know, just to give.
I think, Laura, if I can just come in there, you can almost recognise the Liverpool of today in that book. It's incredible.
Yes, you can.
It's got that real sense of a sailor town. And what's fascinating is that the main character, Redburn, he's walking around Liverpool docks with the map that his father had given him, but the map is about 50 years out of date. So he's completely confused by this new. It shows how Liverpool was changing that rapidly. But it's a fascinating book, and real insight into some of the attitudes and the social conditions of Liverpool at that time. As you say, it's much later than this, but it's a fascinating book.
I think that's, you know, the object of the exercise really is to show Liverpool a bit more realistically. You know, because what we've got is, well, we have a map, because Chadwick did a map in 1725, and it's not long after that. So we know it looked like this. But the only thing else that we've got really are a couple of paintings of the foreshore, and they're not really, they don't give you a sense or a feel for the so hopefully this, you know, articulated a little sort of more.
So just to give people their bearings now, where that dock is, which became known as Old Dock, that's where the Hilton Hotel now is. Is that correct?
Absolutely right. So this is effectively Liverpool 1, as people would know it now.
Yes, it is.
Before they built the Albert Dock.
Yeah. So if you go directly over here onto this jetty, the Salthouse Dock is built, and the Albert Dock will occupy the space at the very bottom there. Because of course today you can walk over from the Hilton directly to the Albert Dock, but the shoreline is obviously much further back now, and the land was reclaimed in order to build those later docks, you know. But that's right, Brian, you know, here we've got Pool Lane running from the old dock to the church on the left, and that became, I think, South Castle Street. And on the top right-hand side, well, the custom house is at the head of the dock at the top. And on the right-hand side, you've got...
This one here.
That's right.
And there was some speculation that the person who designed Bluecoat, but that's not true. But there's similarities you can see in the architecture.
So again, Queen Anne style, brick-built stone dressings, you know, you can understand why.
So did they drain? They drained the pool. They sort of dammed it.
Yes, they did. Yeah,
that must have left a lot of soggy land, though, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was known as a wetland for quite a long time, I think, wasn't it? Some of the houses.
After that,
it's still a bit. A lot of basements down there are still pretty damp.
Yeah.
You know, you have these stories of clubs getting flooded in the, you know, that were directly built on top of the old pool. It's still there. The water's still there, but it's obviously comes up now and again.
So is that because, Brian, if it's flowed one way like that, it will always want to, even if you try and stop it?
I presume so, yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Isn't it?
And so it's worth mentioning as well that this is the dock that kind of made Liverpool world famous, because it was the first of its kind in the world. Is that right?
That's right. It was the very first enclosed wet dock in the world, I think. They took a big chance, Liverpool merchants. You had to get an Act of Parliament to build a dock in those days. And it had to be financed. And I think they went out on a financial limb to build it. But it repaid itself 1,000-fold very quickly.
It must have been very expensive, right?
Very expensive, but the returns were enormous. And of course, it transformed the town.
Yeah.
As would the next several docks going forward, you know.
So amazing.
Interesting point of which
Mediterranean feel. Maybe not.
Yeah.
One last thing.
It was all new. That was the other thing.
What church is this here? Can I ask?
St George, is it?
St George's, yeah.
St George, yeah.
So it's just at the head of Castle Street.
Yes, yes.
And you can see the shape of the castle as it was in the streets around it. And in fact, that street above St George's Church is called Castle Ditch.
Oh.
What it was built in, you know.
It must have had a moat, did it? Liverpool Castle?
Yeah. I think partly dry, partly wet, I think. But
I mean, they're so mind-blowing, Ed. The detail is amazing. And that kind of brings us on to the reason why I came across you in the first place. Right. And that's because of an image you made of the Bluecoat and its environs. Is that the right way to say it? The area around Bluecoat. Which is just mind-blowing for me to see, because one of the things I think you do really well is to capture the humanity behind the maps. So every time I look at a map like the ones that you've brought to life, I feel a sense of I'm kind of stressed out by it. And I now realise from seeing your work why I feel stressed out by it. And it's because I wanted to see it like that. So I see the little trees and stuff, and I'm like, is that a tree or what's that? So it might be worth me now showing that image. Do you want me to do that, Ed?
Certainly. Yeah, I think that's...
Or do you want me to show the map that you made the image from first?
It might be worth showing the image, and then if we look at, just orient ourselves to what the image is about in the way that we've done with the others, just to give a feel for it, and look at the map and see where it came from. And in reality, I think we've said before,
that's the right one, Ed.
That's right. So again, just to orient ourselves here, this is 1769. So although I've done now 20 scale pictures going right up to 1939, this is actually a hop back to a painting that's been 7 years in gestation, really, for one reason or another. And in many ways, it's the most interesting one, I think, because it shows a piece of Liverpool that everybody will be familiar with.
Perhaps, Ed, if you could give us the main thoroughfare there. I can see Church Street.
Just from the point of view of orienting ourselves, the bottom road running from right to left, as it were, diagonally, is Church Street. And there is the church from which Church Street takes its name, and that's St. Peter's, which was Liverpool's pro-cathedral. I mean, we'll come back to this, I think, in a little bit more detail. Just for now, we just sort of name the streets. And running from right to left, you'll hit the junction of Hanover Street, running diagonally right.
This one?
That's it. And back again to that junction up to Bold Street, which at that stage hasn't been laid, but is at this point several rope walks, 300 or 400 yard rope walks where they made the long ropes required by shipping. And from that junction again, left Ranelagh Street, point at which you'd find Central Station now, I guess. Down on Church Street there's some other things we might look at, but where the arrow is now, I guess that might be Primark.
That's Primark.
Other shops are available. opposite M&S. So people would be very familiar with that, but the look is so different. I think that's what makes it fascinating. most importantly, I think for the purposes of this discussion, right middle is that familiar H of the Bluecoat.
There.
Which always seems to have been here, and of course is, you know, the oldest secular building in central Liverpool. And that was for me, the fascinating bit, really, that the building that you can walk around today features in this picture as long ago as 1679.
Unreal.
So I guess the thing to look at might be the map that this came from, which is a map drawn by George Perry. It was a guy it was actually from Somerset, but he came up to Liverpool to manage the Phoenix Iron Foundry. So there's Church Street at the bottom with the church that we were looking at, St. Peter's Church. And this is a section that covers the scope of the picture. It isn't the entire map. The entire map is huge, of the entire scope of Liverpool, obviously. And is a bit of a masterpiece, really. He was a man of many talents, George Perry. And I think he regarded himself as a cartographer, but it wasn't always accurate. But you can see some of the features that are in the picture, including the rope walks on the left-hand side, which would become Bold Street.
Yes.
That I've imagined more kind of realistically as you can see a tree-lined and open air.
Yeah.
At the bottom left-hand side, there's another ropery, which is part open air, part enclosed, called the White Ropery, and that would become the space in which St. John's Market would be built in 50 years' time.
Oh, wow.
You can see that shape of the market almost, you know, in that. And in the centre again, right, is that H, very clearly marked, of the Bluecoat. And so what we had to do really was we know how the city is placed, but we don't know what these buildings look like. It's again a question of looking at a huge number of engravings, of paintings that were done of the area, of later paintings that were done of buildings that we knew predated them, that listed on this map, and piecing together how that might have looked. And using our imagination in other ways to look at these more rural areas, and particularly where you see in the centre a very ornate garden that was part of the land of Thomas Seal, after whom Seal Street gets its name. Seal Street isn't laid yet, but will be shortly. And his house is there. We have a picture of what his house looked like. So all in all, what we're doing is beginning to reconstruct using a wide variety of sources of information, how this, and hence where the picture comes from. With a reasonable degree of accuracy, we know that's probably what it looked like. A little bit more difficult around the Bluecoat. Sorry.
Do you say that these maps weren't always accurate? Was that just because it was really hard to make them accurate, or?
Yeah, I think probably a couple. I think did George Perry work with a guy called Yates and Perry? They were a bit of a team for doing previous maps, but I think it was a pretty big job, and I don't think that they could always guarantee that they were going to be able to draw things as accurate as they could over such a large scale. I guess things changed as well, even while they were surveying land. You know, people were rebuilding and extending and that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
One thing which is really interesting here, Ed, is that the names of the streets, because if you look at the Bluecoat, we're now in School Lane, but here it's called Schoolhouse Lane.
Oh, yeah?
So the name changes. At some point, it changes. And at the back, you've got College Lane. And we've had a lot of conversations at Bluecoat about how both these streets got their name. And we're pretty convinced that Schoolhouse Lane is named after the Bluecoat, because the lane didn't exist until the Bluecoat was built.
Right.
But College Lane's really interesting, because we're not sure, does that relate to perhaps another college that was there, or some other educational building, or what? So we're still trying to find out where College Lane comes from. But
Do you
School Lane,
think, Bryan, that was nothing to do with Bluecoat then?
well, it could have been, but if it's called school in one lane and then college in another, you think, why are they using two different names for an educational institution?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose this is part of the challenge, isn't it, of history. We know something happened, as somebody famous once said, that we're having to interpret the way things are from sources that aren't always particularly clear, or which might be inaccurate, making best guesses in some ways. But at some point, I think you have to say go and produce a picture, and then along the way, these pictures have to be amended. And we found that particularly with the Bluecoat, where the research that we've done after the painting was produced convinces me that Perry had got the shape of the Bluecoat wrong.
At the back.
Yeah, really?
There was something about the other artifacts in research which convinced me that George Perry had got the shape of the, at least the rear of the Bluecoat wrong. And some of those things I didn't discover until after I'd finished the painting. And this is what happens. You have to be prepared to amend it. So the top left here is an image which I think is the only image, which I stole from you, Bryan, the only image of the rear of the Bluecoat. And at this stage, it's got a semicircular gate portal, which is the same as the front that we know today. But more importantly, I think there were two fairly substantial wings that aren't, in a sense, connected to the building. I think they are connected in a way, but they're not. As Perry's shown it on the H of his plan that you can see there, bottom right, he shows the front wings running directly into the back wings. In other words, contiguously, they share a border. And the reality is, from this painting, they don't share a border, I think. And then if you look at the top right, Chadwick's 1725 map, you can see that. The U shape is the front of the Bluecoat, and the two spurs at the back are non-contiguous. Mm-hmm. So not in the way that Perry showed them. And in fact, the eyes map of 1765, bottom left, shows exactly the same. The two wings are displaced. But this one, slightly before the Perry map, they've now got rid of, by the looks of it, the semicircular gate portal at the back. And it looks like it's been, planted in some way. I think it might have been either an arboreal walk or a garden or an orchard or something like that. So that convinced me. And so the bottom right shows the way in which the painting on the left needs to be amended. Mm-hmm. So that amendment I will carry out as soon as the painting returns to me, when it's not self-isolating in the printers. So, and that's very much the process, I think. It's trying to get the thing as accurate as possible, using all the research possible. But I'm not an expert at this. I think an awful lot of people help me once the painting's been released to get to that point of correction. So the painting itself is much more accurate after a period of time. And that's the joy of doing it, really. I think the seeing it, those 2D images rise up in 3 dimensions to look like, hopefully, all of that time ago.
I think if we just stay on this page for a bit, because there's some fascinating details which you perhaps don't think of at first. As you said, this is the back of the Bluecoat, and many people today wouldn't recognise that. They think that's the front, and of course it's not. So this was demolished, and these small buildings, these wings, are much lower than the main core, and they were almshouses when they were built. And perhaps I'll come on to should I do the sort of history of this?
Yes, please, Bryan. One of the things that's interesting too is that the front is open to the road, isn't it? And so Bryan, it'd be great to hear for you to give us a bit of an idea, to talk us through the kind of history of Bluecoat. And
Ed, in your new drawing of it, you've got the backs quite tall, but I don't think they've ever been as tall as the front. So
yeah, I think you're right. I think that's the first shot probably as an amendment. I think you're absolutely right. What will have to be done on the actual painting is those two rear wings will have to be dropped at least one story, I think.
Yeah.
And to make sure that they look clearly.
Yeah, I think so.
Lower than the front wings.
Yeah. But it began life as a charity school, and the original Bluecoat school was on a different site. And it was in 1708 they founded the school. They probably built it in 1709. And it was founded by the Anglican Church, St. Peter's Church, which we've seen, and really funded by a guy called Bryan, who was a master mariner making money from the new dock. And he convinced a lot of his colleagues to basically put their hand in their pocket and fund this school. And you've got to remember, this is a time of curious contradictions, which we find difficult to grasp now, that this was philanthropy. These people were doing good work because this was a charity school for the orphan kids of the town. It was a town then, it was about maybe 6,000 people. But a lot of social problems, because a lot of the children, particularly being port town, were perhaps orphans because their fathers might have been lost at sea. So you've got this, on the one hand, this philanthropy, a charity school built by mariners, and what are they making their money from? As Ed said before, slavery starts to become a big industry in Liverpool. In fact, it fuels most of the developments of the 18th and early 19th century. And there didn't seem to be any problem with that from the perspective of these very pious religious people. And we're doing a lot of work at the moment with academics, and we're exploring where that funding came from and the extent to which the money that built the school derived from slavery. And it's a pretty startling statistic. Maybe it's not so startling because most of Liverpool was built on slavery, but many, maybe as much as 60% of the funding that was coming into the school was being derived from the slave trade, either directly from slave ships or from the trades which were enabled through slavery in the Americas: sugar, cotton, tobacco. But I think that's probably, we're going to further explore that. And if you go on the Bluecoat website, there's quite a lot of information about this already. But returning to the school itself, in 1717, this new building emerges, the one we're looking at now. And there's been a lot of speculation about who actually built it. And the research we've done convinces us that Thomas Steers, who was the dock engineer who'd a few years earlier had masterminded the dock with Edward Litherland, the mason. Those two were the key people responsible for the design and the build of Bluecoat School, Bluecoat Charity School as it was. As I said before, the dock, which we saw earlier on, became known as Old Dock, was this first commercial wet dock in the world. And it was literally a stone's throw, maybe sort of, 2-minute walk, 3-minute walk at most, from the school down to the dock. So this very close connection, the Bluecoat had a very close connection with maritime trade. So the foundation stone for the Bluecoat was laid in 1716. They completed the first bit in the dedication on the front of the building says 1717. We know for a fact that actually the children didn't move in until 1718, and they didn't finish building the back bit, which we've just been talking about, till 1725. It cost £2,288. And a lot of that money came out of Bryan Blundell's own pocket, supported by these other merchants that I mentioned before. I'm going to go on very quickly because we need to get back to that drawing or painting. It's fantastic. 1732, Liverpool's first workhouse was built by the Bluecoat. So the Bluecoat owns the land that it's situated on, which was gifted to it by the Corporation of Liverpool. And the first workhouse was built there. The one we saw in one of Ed's later paintings moved up to where the Catholic Cathedral was then built. Blundell died in 1756, and his son, Jonathan, takes over as treasurer. And so the Blundell family carries on being involved with the building for most of the 18th century. The school buys some adjacent land in 1763 and builds a factory, in other words, for making stockings. And one thing you've got to remember about this time, it was a charity school, but it was also an industry. These kids who are being rescued from, poverty, didn't exactly have it that easy. So they had to do about 2/3 of their day was spent manufacturing, making pins, making stockings, and only 1/3 on lessons. This was in the early years of the school.
When you say stockings, you mean socks, right?
Socks, yeah.
You don't mean like tights.
No. But they
were very advanced.
They were weavers, and I think there was some. I think some of them had to make their own uniforms, and they did wear blue coats. People say, where does the idea of blue coat come from? What is it? And blue is the sort of colour that denotes charity, symbolically, and so we think that there's some sense there that it reflected the charitable nature of the school. And there were about 30 other blue coat schools at that time across England and Ireland. The first one was in Horsham, well, it's in London, but it moved down to Horsham and became Christ's College. And I think it was a sort of template for a charity school. So if you want to set up a charity school, you called it a blue coat school.
There's one in Chester too, Bryan, and it looks very like blue coat.
Very similar, and it was built literally a year later, so it's very, very close in time. But I don't think there's any formal connection between the blue coat schools.
Their almshouses remain. They're still intact.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
So you can see an example of an almshouse at Bluecoat in Chester.
Yeah. Anymore, but I think because really my timeline's come up to about the 60s now, the 1760s, which is when this painting was, or this map was done. So maybe what we should now do is go back to the
it's really interesting.
And Ed, perhaps we can talk a bit more about some of the detail and the environs of School Lane.
Because I would like to say a few things that I noticed about it, actually, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Firstly, that the only other building that still exists today on this map, I think, is that right, Ed, is the Hanover Hotel.
I think there might be two, and I've only just recently discovered this, I think, but one, you're right. The Hanover Hotel is...
Here, this white one, is it?
Two left, so it's smaller.
That one.
Now, that's a mistake on my part because that's actually should be 4 bays. And the reason for that is there is a picture of looking down Hanover Street, which shows that building. But I think the 4th bay is simply hidden behind, and the 4 bays makes it the Hanover Hotel, I think. It's been knocked.
Ed, I can't see any bays. You must have a very good eyesight.
Bays in the sense of bays in the sense of windows, rows of windows.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
But if there's only 3 across that, isn't there?
There's only 3, and there should be 4. So that's a. But up above, do you see that line of trees at the top, which is Duke Street?
Yeah.
At the very top of the picture.
Yeah.
A line of trees runs from left to right, and that was what was called. I think I'm right in saying it was called the Ladies' Walk. Like an arboreal pleasure walk before Duke Street was laid. But towards the right of that is Wolstenholme Square, where...
the beginnings of Wolstenholme Square.
It's a bit further right.
Over here?
Down a bit.
It's like I'm scratching your back.
Oh, if you see, there's like you see Thomas Seale's garden.
Yes.
Well, just above that, that's Wolstenholme Square.
So one of these buildings remains
exactly where the arrow is. I think there are 2 buildings still extant. Yeah.
The rest were
they've refurbished Wolstenholme Square, I think. So,
well, you call it refurbish.
So I would like to go and see whether those 2 houses exist, but I can't at the moment. So
they do, and I think over the road, Ed, there might be one more. Maybe.
Where Cream was.
Definitely there's one in the corner, isn't there?
Yeah.
And
is that where Cream was?
Cream was sort of here on this cabbage plot.
Yeah.
That was Cream. Wolstenholme Square is very historic. The building that you're referring to for a time was an artist space. You remember, Bryan? Wolstenholme Creative Space.
That was, yeah.
Okay.
And it was almost intact inside. It had a lot of original stuff still in there. And then it was sold to a person who opened a bar, and they just gutted it.
It was quite a dangerous sort of venue, wasn't it? With
it was quite dangerous.
you had to watch yourselves going up those rickety stairs. I remember it.
It was one of those fun, like, underground style that you don't really get so much anymore. So that's the other building that's but what I think people might find really amazing is how old that Hanover Street Hotel is. There's a bar in there called McCartney's, is there?
Mm-hmm.
And you can play pool in there. I mean, I haven't been in for many years, but either side of this is Wood Street, is that right?
Yeah.
And the other side is no longer.
So Wood Street, oh, so that's Fleet Street, which is the
Fleet
Street there, and Wood Street, the next one towards Bold Street.
Yeah.
That's Wood Street.
That's Wood.
The big timber yard there. I don't know whether that's the Wood.
What's that one then? Because that's Duke, isn't it?
The one you're pointing at now is called Mr. Seal's Waint, and it was like a little alleyway that went up to the Arboreal Gardens.
What about this bit here?
That is a little alleyway. I'm not really sure what the name of that was. We'd have to go back to the...
Oh, don't worry. It's not important. The other thing that's interesting for me, because I have spent the last 10 years researching Bold Street, is that obviously Bold Street is not here. Now, I've read some stuff about the sale of this land and how Bold Street developed, because it sort of came about later on in the 17th. I think it was sort of 1770. I think, Bryan, do you know? 1780? No. It came about much later than this. Well, maybe 20 years after this map.
Yeah,
and it was sold off. One side was sold off first. So one side developed much quicker. And the other, that's how they sold it off in these strips. And people often think that Bold Street's the way it is because of these rope walks. But if you put Bold Street on there, it doesn't correlate to the rope walk. And the rope walks are only there, I think, because of these strips of land. You know, that was quite common then, was it, selling these strips of land off or having these strips? And the other things that are interesting for me about your painting is how to life it brings the energy of the town. I presume it was a town at this time.
Yes, it was.
And a town with 6,000 inhabitants, is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't get city status either for another 100 years, you know.
Oh, really? So is that because it wasn't big enough?
It doesn't have a cathedral.
Oh, of course.
Because the church which we're looking at here, that's as Ed said earlier, it's the pro-cathedral. So in other words, it stands in for, it's in lieu of a cathedral.
Oh, is that what pro means?
Yeah.
Pro-cathedral.
Can I just ask, Ed, about the, back to these names of, there's Schoolhouse Lane, but there was also, and I don't know whether you can find it with your cursor there,
yes,
Laura, but the free grammar school, which
is Bryan.
Yeah, you've just gone past it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that building, as far as we know, was the site of the original 1708 Bluecoat School. And when the corporation gave the land to Bluecoat to build the new school, they kept that building, but they rented it out to the pre-existing free grammar school, which was somewhere else in town. So, and they coexisted for quite a while. So you had the free grammar school next to the charity school, and that is now the site of where it's the sort of the Quakers meeting house and the BBC.
Okay.
It's there now.
The other thing, Bryan, is that building, the long building attached to it.
Yeah.
It's the one that Perry marks stocking manufactory.
Yeah. See, this was the bit they bought that bit of land and built the manufactory. Yeah. Which eventually did connect up to the Bluecoat building. And there's only one watercolour, I think, by Herdman that shows that building from the bottom of School Lane. So we got no images, but it was obviously a very important part of the school because it kept growing. It was a boarding school, so they housed the children. It was boys and girls. So it's always confused me. Where did they all sleep? In a tiny, the school looks very magnificent and grand, but actually the rooms are it's quite a small capacity, and they kept build bits on to accommodate the growing number of children. And I think in that manufactory, we have some interior photographs taken at the end of the 19th century of rooms that I don't recognise. So I think it must be that part of the
inside there. Fascinating.
Yeah.
That was still there then, Brian.
Yeah.
You knocked it down in the 20th.
Well, a building, whether it was the original manufacturer, or whether it was a rebuild, I don't know. But the school extended from where it is now, encompassed where the Quaker meeting room is, and went about 2/3 of the way up School Lane.
Yeah.
Unbelievable, right?
It is fascinating, that, Bryan. It really is,
And with the building at the front, so the front is the bit with the orchard, Brian. Is that the front?
That's the front is what you can see, the playground with some. You can see Ed's drawn some children in there. The back is this orchard.
Okay.
And
that
again,
was open.
And in the later 19th century, that was enclosed. So what you've got now is what is now the display centre at the back. That low building was not there. You can see it's a gap.
Yeah.
But eventually that was enclosed, which gives us that beautiful garden, which people love so much now. It's an enclosed garden space. But that was originally opened out onto College Lane at the back.
Yeah.
So
the other correction at the front, of course, is that there's only one set of steps in the courtyard, and there should be 3.
There's 3.
Tell you what, Ed, you've got good eyesight, haven't you, eh?
I used to have.
How do you
I've ruined it.
Do you do it with a magnifying glass?
No, just these. I mean, these are fairly long.
Big.
The ones behind me are typical, probably 3 foot. You can't see it from here, maybe, but 3 foot by 2 foot. So the detail, but they are very detailed, obviously, and the details are very small. And I in my eyesight doing it.
But with your architectural background, Ed, I wanted you to ask about the style of the building. We've talked a little bit about the architect, Steers, with the help of Litherland. But in terms of, I think you said to me before, it's got a bit of a Dutch feel to it. It's a Queen Anne building, technically, although she'd died. The year it was built, she died before then. So
that's right.
It's really actually a Georgian building, but built in the style of the Queen Anne architecture. But let's say a bit more about the style.
Well, I mean, the Queen Anne style, really the tail end of, I mean, it's obviously part of the European Renaissance. And much of that came from, well, obviously came from Italy, but much came through Holland initially. And influenced English architecture as early as the 16th century. But in essence, this is more Italianate, I think. It's and recognisably because you've got a central pediment in the middle of the main building at the back of the courtyard, and the cupola, but also those moulded rounded windows. Well, what gives the Queen Anne style specifically is that it's brick built with those ornate stone mouldings and coins at the corner. So the stone dressings on a brick ground with that Italianate feel give you that uniquely sort of Queen Anne feel. And you saw before the old custom house that stood on the old dock had a very similar kind of look, a red brick with dressings. And there's a slight difference between that and the way perhaps the more plain Georgian look subsequently developed. So Dutch, maybe Dutch, not so much. I mean, that's probably more in the influence of the way in which Renaissance architecture came over to Britain, kind of thing. But very much more Italianate, I think, really. In its style. But yeah, Queen Anne, and as you say, she wasn't around by the time this was actually built, but it's style. And that was actually revived again in the 19th century in Liverpool as well.
I wonder what made them choose that style, because it's beautiful, but I wouldn't. I mean, it's functional, of course, but you might expect a school to be a bit more of a big, brutal building. That
plain building.
yeah, you might have expected it not to be so fancy. I mean, was this about the egos of like Bryan Blundell and all that to say, look what we've built?
I think there was a degree of that. It was certainly the most impressive sort of building. I mean, Daniel Defoe comes to Liverpool a bit later, and he raves about the quality of the buildings. He said that there's nowhere outside London where you got finer quality of buildings. And I think Bluecoat must have been one of the, he doesn't name it, but I'm sure it's one of the buildings he's thinking of. But no, I mean, you've got to remember this painting of Ed's is taken from a map from the mid-century. But when the school was built early on in the century, there was very little around here. So the church was there, obviously, but most of it was all fields. So this would have been a very iconic building, a symbolic building. And I think, yes, it was a functional school building, but it expressed very much the ambition, if you like, of the town at that time. So I'm sure Blundell wanted it to be ornate and distinctive and quite authoritative, not just like the little old school building they had before, which was a tiny little, like a chapel-y type building. So it had a symbolic value as well as being, practically a school. So I think also it surprised me that how actually inside it, the original central core is very narrow. And I thought, why they spend all that money on that ornate fenestration, the cherub heads, the cupola? All this must have cost a lot of money for what is inside was a pretty small footprint.
Yeah.
So in closing, we could talk about this for 3 days straight, to be honest with you.
And we would.
I was so interested, for example, by the orchards and the fish ponds and the gardens and all that kind of thing. You could really do a whole thing just on growing food and industry, because one of the things they did a lot of was lime production and obviously ropes. Now I know that they grew the linen for the ropes in Sefton.
Yeah.
Why you've got Lineker.
Yeah.
For example, you could do it on. You could just keep talking. But may I ask for your final thoughts and comments on these images? And yes, and also I'd like Bryan to finish perhaps by telling us a bit about the book.
Sure.
Okay, well, from my perspective, I mean, obviously this is the 20th in a series of similar pictures, and every one of them brings a new perspective on Liverpool. And even for me, these are surprising when they're finished. The 2D map becomes a 3D image, and there will be more to come, I think, really, hopefully. I can think of lots more of these that can be done. In fact, I've started another one already. But hopefully, the idea is that they don't replace anything. They're not there to preclude any other kind of books or photographs or all of the other kind of resources that exist on Liverpool. They really are hopefully something additional. Something that might articulate for the ordinary person, what Liverpool used to look like, without necessarily going into any real level of detail. So they offer something additional, perhaps facilitate discussion.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's the most important thing about them. I think you described them as aerial landscapes, but they're much more than that. They're little pieces of history, and they are like an open book. That there's a lot of, as we've discovered just by looking at the area around the Bluecoat, you've got it wrong, and some things will change, and so they're very much live works of art, I think, that stimulate, certainly with us, a lot of discussion, and as Laura says, gives you an insight into into perhaps how things were. They're speculative, but there's a lot of evidence. It's all based on research that you've done. I'm amazed at the amount of research you've had to do, to translate this from a flat map into a three-dimensional living sort of object.
Yeah, you take a bit of a chance every time you do one of these, obviously.
Yeah.
But
No, I think they're fantastic. I want to see more and more of them. So just to finish off, and
in physical form in Bluecoat one day.
we will indeed, but perhaps we'll ask Ed in a minute where people can actually see these, because this is a great opportunity to see in detail and hear you talk about it. But I'm sure people will be interested to spend their own time with some of these maps if possible.
I have to say I'm very bad at publicising this work, and the only place where you can see all the media in its entirety is on Twitter at the moment. Now there is a website on the way, and hopefully a book in due course that will contain all the images. But Twitter is the place to go at the moment. It's the only place to go at the moment to see all of the images. Yeah, so hopefully I'll get better at making the images more accessible. We'll see what happens.
Well, much of what I've talked about will be contained in this book that we mentioned earlier.
Okay.
And it's coming out this summer. In fact, it'll be in about a month's time, I think. Liverpool University Press are publishing it. It's me and John Belcham, the great historian of Liverpool. We've co-edited a book which looks at the history. It's called Bluecoat Liverpool, the UK's first art centre. So it tells you very much about the last 100 years rather than the first 200 years of the building. But there's a fantastic chapter in there by Gavin Davenport, who used to work for Bluecoat and did a lot of the research into identifying the architect, and ran our My Bluecoat programme for that year.
Oh yeah,
2017, when we had our tercentenary. So that book will be available from Liverpool University Press in June. And we can't obviously do a launch, not a physical launch at this moment, but we hope in the autumn to do some events around it. So we'll keep you posted on that.